So I want to thank you very much for inviting me to come out. The class that I teach on Sundays is, I call it Kinship Cafe. It also has a channel on YouTube where you can see videos from it. So if you like what we talk about today, you can find out some more information there, and I'll put my websites up so that you can see the different ways you can connect on the information that I have. This will be, well, I was asked to come and do a presentation specifically on acceptance, and specifically from the perspective of a Daoist worldview. Now, my take on Taoism, and this is going to just require a little bit of a clarification here, there is a wide variety of things that go under the title of Taoism. Everything from political philosophy to religion, in the sense that looks very much like a standard religion. I am approaching this as a naturalist, so it's much more of a philosophical presentation on Taoism that you're going to see, and I will cover kind of a basic introduction and focus on the worldview that Taoism has. We're going to be exploring some really different ideas, and sometimes new ideas can be a little threatening or scary. This is just a safe place for us to explore different ideas. If you like something you hear, you can adopt it, and if you don't have to worry about it. But if you can try to have a bit of an open mind as we dive into it, it'll help you to get a better sense of the big picture, and then afterwards you can choose to do with it as you like. So to help us to kind of get oriented, I am showing what's commonly referred to as a serenity prayer, because it helps us to identify a little bit of a more narrow focus on what do we mean by acceptance, because acceptance can be all over the board. Here in this prayer, it's talking about having the serenity to accept the things that you cannot change. And that's really the focus of acceptance that we're going to be looking at in this presentation. But the other thing that's important with this is it goes on to say, and the courage to change the things that I can. So sometimes people have a sense that if we take on a more of an accepting position on things, that it leads to inaction. And this isn't really the case. They're not mutually exclusive. They can both exist at the same time. The trick is to understand, with the wisdom part of it, which side is which. What do I actually have something I can do about, and what parts can I not do anything about? And that's really what we want to try and sort out. And finally, the idea of serenity. So here it's suggesting that if I'm coming from more of a peaceful, serene place, that I'll have the ability to practice acceptance, but it also goes the other way around. That as we develop more of a sense of accepting of things that we cannot change, it leads to a sense of serenity and peace. So this is the direction that we're going to be looking at it today. A little more information about myself. I actually work as a software engineer. And as a software engineer, one of the primary things I have to do is solve problems. And wow, this is not handling the slide transitions. I'm just going to have to fill in some stuff that's not transitioning here for some reason. So as a problem solver in software programming, I have to have a good sense of what the actual problem is. Because if I solve for the wrong problem, it's not a solution that we need, right? So if we're looking at the question of why are we finding it difficult to be accepting, what is the underlying reason behind that that's creating the challenge for us to be able to be more accepting? And so here I'm seeing that there is an underlying assumption that is at work that is going to create the issue. The key thing that I am suggesting is that there is an underlying assumption that we have that is causing us to be resistant to the idea of accepting situations. And that is, it didn't have to be this way. Somewhere in our mind, we're holding on to this idea that there are things that are happening that didn't need to be the way they are, and we're upset about it. What I'm going to do is look at this question for how do we then become more accepting. One, you can't just force your way through it. You have to engage what's going on, and in this case, it's changing that underlying assumption. Again, it didn't have to be this way. And that might sound rather difficult, but that's what we're going to focus on for the balance of the presentation. If you allow me, I'm going to blow that idea up. So, let's get started. First, a quote, and this is anonymous, but this is practically a life quote for myself. We don't see the world as it is. We see the world the way we are. Everything is happening up here, and we don't have direct access to the world. We only have things that come in through our eyes, our ears, our taste, our touch, but then we reconstruct it in our brains in some way to make some sense out of what it is. And there's a process that goes on that shapes it, that is not just a direct access to what is. It goes through an interpretation process. So this is where we're going to look at, again, this underlying story we're telling ourselves that it didn't have to be this way is then shaping how we are seeing the world. And to break this down a little bit more specifically or into something that might be a little bit more actionable, I want to talk about the subjective experience. So when something happens in life where we experience something, it could be somebody cuts us off in traffic, it could be a thought that pops into our head or something that somebody says to us, losing a job, whatever. There is some kind of stimulus that happens in our experience, and then we have an emotional response to that. And I say emotional because as much as we like to think of ourselves as logical people or rational people, ultimately it's emotions that get us to do anything. Mm-hmm. For people who have neurological problems that tend to shut down the emotional centers of the brain, they can still go through a rational process of going through different pros and cons of something, but they can never get to the point of making a decision. So ultimately, it's the emotional side of us that pushes us over the edge to go either left or right that is impacting what's happening here. And that emotional response to whatever the stimulus was feeds back into an ongoing cycle of this experience. Now what happens is it seems like something happened to me and then I respond to it. But that's not the whole story. There's actually another step involved here, and that's interpretation. So when we have something that happens to us, somebody cuts us off in the car, we are coming up with some thoughts in our brain about why that happened. And we might be saying something to ourselves like, that person was so rude, or how could they be so inconsiderate, or maybe they're drinking while they're driving, or who knows. We have no idea, right? But we get these ideas in our mind, and those ideas are giving us then an emotional reaction to that event. Now, funny reframing of this that my daughter told me. She's got a friend named Vivian, and she said that when somebody cuts her off in traffic, she says to herself, man, they must really have to go poo. Now, in doing that, she's like completely reframed the situation. And now she's like, oh, I know what that's all about, and she's understanding, and she enjoys the rest of her drive. Is it true? I have no idea, but we don't know if it was true about the other stuff we were imagining either, right? But now we've got two ways that we can experience the rest of our drive. Are we bent out of shape because somebody cut us off, or are we just fine with what was going on and we can continue with our day? This is where that interpretation process plays such a key role in how we experience life. So, again, to keep us on track, there's that underlying assumption. It didn't have to be this way. That's part of this interpretation that's causing an emotional reaction that is then causing us to either be accepting or not accepting of certain situations. And where that comes from then is ultimately part of a larger set of stories we tell ourselves. We call this a worldview. And so we actually live not just in a world of things, but we live in a world of stories. And those stories, those meta-narratives that guide how we look at and think about the world are the thing that we need to look at. Because if we change that story, then we are changing our experience. So this is kind of a key overview. Now we're going to jump into what does the Tao Te Ching or Taoism have to share with us in this regard. So, some quick things on the Tao Te Ching. So the Tao Te Ching is an ancient classical Chinese document that is the source of where Taoism comes from. And you may have seen it presented as what looks like Tao Te Ching. They're actually both pronounced the same way. This is just an earlier way that they tried to transliterate Chinese into English. And the newer version of doing that spells it closer to how you actually pronounce it. So Tao Te Ching and Tao Te Ching are both the same thing. They're just spelt very differently, but they're referring to the same thing. The other thing is, as I mentioned before, I am going to be presenting this from a philosophical versus a religious perspective. And this isn't just a choice to do this. Now, there's different scholars that are going to argue different ways on whether or not it should be considered a religious document from the beginning. But there's quite a few scholars that would argue that there's a definite shift that happens over time where you see much more of what we think of in terms of religious ideas coming into Taoism long after the Tao Te Ching was actually written. So the context for that is it's attributed to a person named Lao Tzu. And again, you may see his name spelt in different ways. That's the difference in the time frame. It was being the translation tool that they're using for how they get to English. But Lao Tzu, as a word, literally just means old master. And za, which is the term that's being used for master, can also be the term for child. And so some people would make this play that is talking about the old child. That's kind of this weird juxtaposition, but that's not really how it's being used. In reality, it's just saying Master Lao. And again, in this context, most scholars would not agree that he's actually the author. It's most likely a collection of sayings that existed over time that were combined, maybe by Lao Tzu, into what we now have as the Tao Te Ching, but it's really a collection of sayings over a period of time. And when it does come together, it's during a period called the Warring States period in classical China. So what had happened is, from a historical perspective, the first dynasty that we have actual historical records for existed for quite some time. It gets overthrown by a dynasty called the Zhou dynasty. And the Zhou dynasty then is collapsing at this point. And as it's collapsing, there's various feudal lords that are springing up that are all vying for power. And this warring between the different states goes on for just about 200 years. And so this is why it's referred to as the Warring States period. And one of the things that is of prime concern at this point is, how do we make sense out of all this chaos? How do we get things back on track? How do we bring some order to this mess? And so you end up with a ton of philosophers springing up at this point. Just before or at the very beginning of the Warring States period is when Confucius lived. And he would be one of them, but there's many others, including Lao Tzu, that spring up during this time frame, and they call it the 100 Schools of Thought. And it's really the golden age of Chinese philosophy. And so one of the things that we'll see is that there's a dialogue that sometimes goes on between different philosophical ideas in a lot of these different texts. And in particular, within the Tao Te Ching, we will see some direct digs at Confucius, who would be known as Kangzi or Kangfuzi. It gets translated into English as Confucius. And then finally, for just orientation here, this symbol, the yin-yang, you may have come across, and this is typically identified as like the symbol for Taoism, but it didn't exactly originate with Taoism, but they definitely have embraced it and ran with it in many different ways. So, with that, I'm going to jump into a little bit of the opening chapter to get us oriented and to kind of get a sense of how this book speaks to us. The opening line, in a very literal translation, reads, "Tao can Tao, not constant Tao." And you're thinking, oh boy, this doesn't seem too useful. So let's break this down just a little bit. So Tao here is not being translated. As a word, it means way or path or direction. So we could think about it in terms of, if I was going to give you the directions to get to the dining hall, I can tell you what they are, and this would be the way to get there. This would be the Tao to get to the dining hall. And it's literally used in a very common, everyday way like that. It's a way of how something is accomplished. So we can translate that then to help flesh this out a little bit more. So now we've got way can weigh, not constant weigh. So the other thing we notice is that this noun is also being used as a verb. And in Chinese, you can do that. There's not a whole lot of grammatical rules. So what we need to think then is, how would this flow if we were going to translate this into English? And the way that I translate this is, the way that can be followed is not the constant or everlasting, would maybe be another way that's sometimes translated, but constant or enduring way. Okay, so what does that mean? If we think about the Warring States period, where we have all these people that are chaos going on, we've got all these different philosophers offering their own Tao, there are lots of different ways on offer. What the Daoists are saying is that if the Tao that's on offer is something that you can follow, this isn't what we're talking about. So if Confucius is saying something to the effect that if we want to bring order out of this chaos, we need to have everybody recognize their place. They have to know who's above, they have to know who's below, and you have to know what you owe your neighbor in that regard. And if everybody would just stick in their lane, then everything would be fine. So this would be a way that can be followed, but it can also not be followed. Hence the Warring States period. People are not staying in their lane, right? So what the Daoists are saying is that the Tao that they are talking about is above that. It's not simply the human prescribed ways of doing things. It's getting at, what is the nature of reality? How does nature function? What are the ways in which that functions? It might be something more akin to how we talk about like the laws of physics or laws of nature, something like gravity. Gravity, it doesn't matter if you know about it, doesn't matter if you don't like it, there's no way to not follow it, right? It's a way that cannot not be followed. And that's what they're trying to get at here. And one of the implications of that is it lifts it above the level of human concern, in the sense that it's not just how do we engage with each other, but it is how do we fit into this larger picture of the world or even the universe as a whole. So with that, I want to go into a little bit of the big picture worldview that they're operating with. So here, I'm going to present this in layers, but it's important that we think that this isn't really separated into layers. It's just a way for me to help break it apart, to talk about the different pieces, but that really all goes together into one kind of big mess. So we start with the idea of Tao, and understand this as the way, but not just any way, but the way of things, the way things actually function. So some implications of this then is that there's the idea that there's patterns. There's ways that things unfold that we can discover, and if we discover the way those patterns work, then we can do something with it. If there is patterns, and those patterns are regular, that makes it so that our world is actually knowable. Think about if it was random, there's no way you could ever actually learn anything, right? So maybe one day if I hop up, I come back down. The next day if I hop up, I fly off to the moon. Or one day I can eat an apple and it's good for me, and the next day it's poison. There needs to be consistency. There needs to be actual patterns that we can discover in order to live. The other thing that happens then is they become essential for existence itself. If it wasn't a knowable world, if we didn't have some way we could navigate through life because we can learn how things function and how they work, we would be in some serious trouble. So, at the beginning, we start with that there are ways of things, the ways of the world. Then they have this concept of absence. And this is coming from the Chinese word for wu, and I am a long ways from being an expert in speaking or reading Chinese, so if I mispronounce something, we'll just have to go with a poor English attempt at trying to translate. But the concept has to do with not an absence of everything, but an absence of form. So we might be able to think of this more like formlessness. And then with that formlessness, there's this idea of presence. So we have absence and we have presence. Presence is like the idea of with form. So whatever absence is, we can think of it getting configured in different ways that suddenly become things that we can recognize or see. And in that case, they have a very colorful way of talking about that. They refer to it as the 10,000 things. It's just basically means all the stuff that we interact with. So this has very interesting implications for our modern physics way of understanding the world. If we think about us in this room, it can seem like there is nothing in between me and each of you, but in fact we know there's actually a whole lot of stuff in between us. We just can't see it. And even though we all look like separate people and separate chairs and tables and desks, they're all made up actually of the same thing, right? So we have this idea that there are molecules as these basic building blocks that come together to form more complex structures, but these molecules can actually be broken down into atoms, and atoms themselves break down into these smaller particles, and these smaller particles might actually be part of something that's called a quantum field. What did we just discover? Everything is actually one thing, but it's just in different configurations. It's fascinating that the Daoists had this kind of a concept. Obviously, they didn't know about quantum physics or, even physics even remotely close to what we're talking about. But their way of looking at the world somehow grasped this underlying aspect of reality, and it became part of how they started to look at the way of things, the Tao, right? So, what are some of the implications of that? It means that when we look at our world, we are not a visitor. We are not just something separate from everything else. The stuff that our entire world is made of, whether we're talking about rocks and trees and rivers and clouds, same stuff that we're made of. We are very much embedded and a part of this entire system. And not only our world, but as we look out into the universe, everything is made out of the same stuff. Everything is actually one thing that is manifested in different configurations. Another interesting aspect of this is that things only exist in relation to other things. So if I was to ask the question, how fast am I going right now? You might say, well, you're not going anywhere. But what if we ask the question, how fast am I going relative to the sun? Well, now we've got to understand the world is spinning around very quickly, and it's orbiting around the sun very quickly. So I'm actually moving very quickly. But the idea of speed as an attribute of Jim doesn't have any meaning at all apart from a relationship to something else. And literally everything about me and you and everything you can think of only exists in relationship to something else. Is something big or small? How do you know except for in relation? Is something taking a long time or a short time? How do you know except in relationship to something else? Time, color, size, space, weight, all these things mean nothing apart from relationships. So in those relationships is how everything is actually formed. The other thing then is if everything is one thing and everything is in relationship to everything else, and attributes of what we think of are going to be impacted by any changes that happen in the system. So even little things can have big consequences, which can get us to a point where we might feel like, how do we even know what to do? if everything I'm going to do in my life is going to have consequences and it's going to ripple out all over the place, this can be almost kind of concerning. Like it can almost be paralyzing. Like, what do I do next? Well, this is where we get to this idea of wisdom. Is the question that, yes, everything we do is going to impact someone or something else, and vice versa, and there's no way around that. Given that, it helps to get us to think about, well, what should we be doing if that's in fact the case? And that's what the wisdom traditions are trying to give us. So again, if we think about how everything is interconnected and related in this giant web of everything that exists, there's a couple of very fascinating aspects of this for us. One is, little or small is not insignificant. You may have heard about the concept of chaos theory. A butterfly flaps its wings in China and there's a hurricane in Brazil. Or some other city. There's lots of different ways I've heard this talked about. But what's happening here? Chaos theory isn't saying that the underlying structure of everything is actually chaos. What they're saying is that lack of knowledge about things, even small things, can build up to big changes over time. So when we think about something like trying to predict the weather, this is trying to get a handle on a wide variety of things that are in action, that are happening, that we need to, if we understand those patterns, we can start to predict what's going to happen next based off of all these different pieces that are in play when we're thinking about weather. However, small things can't be accounted for. There's too much information. There's no way to actually gather all that information. And so very quickly, our predictions start to go off track. So we can predict the weather, but only so far, right? Because there's all these really little tiny things that we don't know about that are having a big impact. So little is not insignificant. The other thing I want to talk about quickly is complexity theory. And I don't know if you can see this, it's a little bit dark, but what we're seeing here is some starlings that form these fascinating shapes in the sky, right? I mean, it's just mesmerizing. You watch it and you think, how does this work? Is there some kind of conductor for the swarm that's saying, okay, you go here, you go there? And what we find is it's not. What happens is every bird has a few simple rules that it follows in terms of what its neighbor is doing. And out of these tiny set of rules that they just look to their neighbor at a very local level, it ends up producing something that looks very complex and it looks very organized, but really there's nobody in control. There's nobody in charge. It's just how these patterns play out. All the cells in our body kind of function in a similar way. They know enough about what to do based off of who their neighbor is or what thing they bump into. They don't know about the whole body. Nobody in your body knows about the whole body, right? There's nobody conducting or organizing or orchestrating it. It's just a bunch of small things that know how to interact with their neighbor, and it produces a complexity that seems marvelous. So, we have absence and presence. Without form, with form. Very interesting how these tie in so clearly with our modern way of thinking about things. They also will have this clear idea that it kind of goes full circle. So things come into existence, which isn't exactly the right way to say it, because it's not coming from nothing. It's coming from, form is coming from formlessness, but not from nothing, right? And then at some point, things are born and they grow and they die and they decompose and they go back to absence, right? It's like the parts get reused. And within this realm then of presence is where we have the concept of yin-yang. And here is the idea that there are variations. So there could be long comes with short, right? They're kind of two ends of this spectrum. You can have heavy and light, or male and female, or any other kinds of pairs that you want to think of. The idea of yin-yang is that there's a balance between those, and that it's constantly changing. So the fact that in the white portion, which is the yang, you see a little black dot, This is to say that yang is not completely yang, that there's a bit of yin in it. And yin has a little white dot, right? But they're also in this like swirling motion because one thing has a tendency to turn into the other. Sometimes it takes time, maybe more time than we have, but over a long period of time, you see this happening all the time. Within our own kind of way of talking about things, we might use a pendulum. First swings one way and then it's going to swing back the other way. We talk about this in politics, how things get off balance. If things were closer to the middle, if they were more balanced, there would be less dramatic swings. But when things get off to the side, it's going to come back even further to the other side. So yin-yang is a way of thinking about the balance of things and how they operate in our world. And it becomes part of how they will critique what is wrong. So they might say, well, the problem that you have is that there's too much yang and not enough yin, or too much yin and not enough yang, right? And that needs to be addressed. And certainly this is going to be the case that's happening within the Tao Te Ching. So if we think about yin and yang, then the yang side tends to be focused on this idea of masculine, control. We'll maybe just stick with those two for the moment. Yin would be female, and it would also be dealing with the idea of chaos, but chaos in the sense of novelty, newness. So we can think about life emerging as much more kind of this feminine trait, and that can be unpredictable. Things come up that we're not planning for, let's say. So with that yin-yang, if we're thinking about that control versus the chaos, you can see how there needs to be a balance. Because if it was just all control, everything would be static and fixed and unbending, and that would not be good. If everything was new all the time, it would be just kind of chaotic and we wouldn't know what to do. So there's always like this balance that needs to be achieved. It's not that one is better than the other or more preferred than the other. They're both needed in order to have that balance. Both control and chaos are necessary for life to exist. If it gets out of balance, it threatens life on either side. Part of the Taoist critique of the warring states period is there's way too much yang going on. That too much control, too much of this trying to conquer and divide, whereas they're going to suggest that what's needed is much more of a insistence on the yin. And so throughout the Tao Te Ching, you see a strong emphasis on feminine aspects, both in terms of talking about where the culture needs to go, but also how they look at the world in the first place. It tends to be much more rooted in this generative aspect of life, which probably goes back to a pre-agricultural time. It's probably a sustained argument from the Paleolithic period, where at that time, the fascination with the natural world was its ability to produce life, to provide the things that we need. And so when you go back 40,000 years and you see the types of figurines that come up that are trying to represent what's happening in the world, they call them these Venus figurines, and they tend to emphasize the things that have to do with reproduction. And that would be why the female was really much more of the focus. When we come into the period of agriculture, everything changes. When you are nomadic, traveling, you don't have much of anything. You have maybe some tools and maybe your tent, small collection of people, and you're traveling around. As soon as you figure out how to do agriculture, then you've figured out how to sustain larger populations in a single place. But then you've got place. And place, all of a sudden now, is potentially at risk, because other people could come and try and take your place. So you have to deal with like defense. How do we protect it? And all of a sudden, the attributes that are more associated with men tend to come into into the fore, because they are now aspects of this new way of organizing human activity around this agricultural period. Humongous impact in terms of what happens with human sociology going forward. So, Tao Te Ching is preserving that Paleolithic perspective and reasserting it into what's happening in the crisis in their culture at that time, really trying to address, we need to bring that yin back into the balance. And then finally, in this picture that I'm showing, we've got Da. It looks like D, it's spelled D-E, but it's pronounced Da. And this is the Da as in Dao De Jing. Da is a character that has to do with how well something actually manifests the way or the Tao. So things like rivers, mountains, trees, dogs, butterflies, whatever, we would say they are all perfectly demonstrating or mirroring those patterns of Tao, the way, because that's just in their nature, that's just what they do. And in fact, Da is oftentimes translated as nature. Humans, a little bit different, because we got this thing that gets in the way, where we get these ideas, and all of a sudden we think that we can disregard certain things or not pay attention to the interconnectedness or the various aspects of the patterns of the world. And when we do, we start to really mess things up, and we get in the way of ourselves. So Da, then, would be almost like a goal within Taoism for how do we bring our lives into alignment with Tao, and that we actually represent those patterns in our own life. And this final part here, non-action, this is how we're translating the phrase Wu Wei, which you may have heard before, is talking about how we act. So for the Daoists, if you read through the Tao Te Ching, you'll see several instances where they talk about returning to the state of a newborn infant. And it's not because they want everybody to become infantile, it's because a child, a baby, has not yet been enculturated. All the different ideas and thought patterns and perspectives of the world haven't been imprinted on the kid yet. And so it's responding, it's acting just in a very natural way. So this idea of non-action is not non-action in terms of not doing anything. It's not acting according to these socially constructed ways of trying to be. Now, it doesn't mean that there's not ultimately going to be some agreed upon formalities about how things are done, but what they're really concerned about is how do we recognize the arbitrariness of those things so that we can get at more of that baseline of what is, not what should be, but what is, and from there we can move forward. But when we get that cultural imprint, we have this idea that we already know, and we don't. And we act in ways that our culture tells us to act that are maybe inconsistent with Tao, and hence the problem. So, that in a nutshell is the Taoist perspective, the Taoist worldview, and some of the key terms that come up. So now that we've kind of got that, I'm just going to step through kind of quickly the first chapter so you can see then what this looks like and how it plays out in terms of the text. So, a way that can be followed is not the enduring way. So we kind of went through that. This is not the socially constructed ways of doing things, but the way of nature itself. Then they bring up, almost in a parallel way, names can name no enduring name. And what's happening here is that if everything is in fact one thing, that is fundamentally something we need to be aware of, but it becomes very difficult in terms of being able to talk about anything. So what happens is we've got these 10,000 things, and we need to have some way to label them in order that we can navigate our world or communicate with language. And we can start to talk about Jim as a separate thing, Michelle as a separate thing, and so forth, or the chair and the table. And that's helpful, but it can become problematic if we start to think that that's actually describing the reality, that things are separate, that they're individual pieces, things that can be used as resources. So we have to always be suspicious of the language aspect of things because it will be misleading. Yes, it's helpful, but it's very ambiguous at the same time. We could take something simple like your neck. Where exactly does your neck start and where does it end? And who says? Right? But it's a word that we use all the time, but if we really think about it, it gets complicated. Or even, what do we mean by a person? if every 7 years all the cells in my body are replaced, and I've got new ideas than I had before, and I'm certainly much bigger than I was when I was a little kid, am I the same person? I don't know. But the names can give the impression that I am an unchanging thing. But what we're seeing is everything is always changing. The names are helpful, but they're not reality. Hence, the name can name no enduring or consistent name. Absence names the origin of heaven and earth. It's kind of what we were just talking about. Presence names the mother of 10,000 things. So here we can see already this feminine attribute coming into play in terms of motherhood. Therefore, one can, and I have that in brackets there because it's implied but not actually in the text, one can focus on enduring absence to see the mystery. So this would be focusing on that oneness aspect. Or one can focus on the enduring presence to see the manifestations. So we can almost think about like different levels of how we do science. We have people that study physics or quantum mechanics that are dealing at that oneness level, right? But then there's a category of biology that's dealing with different life forms. That would be kind of like the distinction here of how you could have different focuses that you can approach things. But it says these are both the same, yet differ in name. Call this darkness within darkness. So, let's go back to yin-yang for a second. We can sometimes think about darkness as something that's bad or negative or scary. Here, it's making reference to that yin aspect. That yin is where we're going to recapture the ideas that are going to help make sense of the challenge of absence and presence and how do we understand the different aspects of it. And then it concludes with, this is the gateway to all mysteries. So this is just the opening chapter. It kind of functions as an overview for the rest of the book, but it's like this throughout. Small little sections of text that are dealing in poetic ways with the nature of reality and how do we live in it. So, getting back to our question about acceptance and how does this play in? So a couple of things. One, we want to notice a couple of the key aspects then of this Daoist worldview, the Daoist story. Patterns are central. They make existence itself a thing that can happen, and it makes our world a knowable world. Without those, we would not be able to actually know anything or understand anything about our world. But if we think about atoms and how they function, if they didn't follow these regular patterns and the way that they share electrons with each other, there could never be molecules, and even within the atom itself, it would just come apart. Everything in the universe would literally disintegrate if there were not these regular patterns that are consistent and predictable, that we can know and understand how our world works. We also need to keep in mind this idea of oneness as opposed to separateness. A lot of our Western worldview is based on the idea that we have these different things that can just be used for our own benefit, and not recognizing how these things are connected, not recognizing that small is not insignificant. And then finally, the idea of how things are all related to each other. They're not independent. So if we take these concepts then and start to look at how do we replace the story, it didn't have to be this way. One, we might start with recognizing that there's a value judgment that's happening. So if we're saying it didn't have to be this way, the implication is it was bad. It shouldn't have happened that way. So Daoists are very hesitant about any type of moral language. It could very easily be argued that they argue for what's called amorality, a non-morality way of looking at the world. And here's an example of that. This is a parable. There was a farmer that had a horse, and that horse ran away. And all the townspeople come out to the farmer because this is considered an important part of the farmer's life, right? And the horse is gone, and all the people come and say, "Oh, what a horrible thing! Your horse ran away." And the farmer's reaction is to say, "We'll see." A little while later, the horse actually comes back, but brings friends with it. So now the farmer has a whole bunch of horses, and all the people come back and say, "Wow, what a fortunate thing." And again, the farmer says, "We'll see." And the farmer's son is trying to break in one of the horses, and as he's doing it, he falls off and breaks his leg. And again, all the townspeople say, "Oh, how unfortunate." The farmer says, "We'll see." Then the emperor comes through town conscripting all the young boys to go off and fight in war, but his son can't go because he's got a broken leg. And everybody again comes back and says, "Oh, how fortunate." And again, we'll see, right? So what's happening here? The same thing is viewed as positive or negative, good, bad, and it keeps flip-flopping, right? It's not in itself that any of these things are in fact good or bad. It's we're making an assertion, a value judgment about that. I think my wife brought up that quote from Shakespeare earlier today. It was, nothing is either right or wrong, or good or bad or something like that, except thinking makes it so. And that's part of what they're trying to get at here. There's also this idea of perspective, that if we wait, things have a tendency to change, right? So that yin-yang, there's a little bit of the yin and the yang and vice versa, and it kind of goes around, and things keep changing. So this idea of having these value judgments can be problematic. It can add to that story that we're telling ourselves that it didn't have to be this way in a negative way. The other thing that we need to recognize is how we can take this and put it into that experience cycle in terms of how we're interpreting through a story. So another parable that has to do with how things get interpreted from this Daoist perspective. There's a man who needed to go from one side of the river to the other in his boat, but it was kind of foggy out and he couldn't see very well, so he puts a lantern out on the front of his boat so that other people could see if he's coming. Starts making his way across the river, and all of a sudden he sees vaguely through the fog that there's another boat coming, but it looks like it's coming right at him. So he yells out, "Hey, I'm over here, watch out." But the boat doesn't seem to make any correction, and it gets closer. And he's getting more concerned now and getting more agitated, like, what's this guy thinking? "Hey, I'm over here, watch out." But he keeps coming. And now he's just incensed. He's just totally angry at this guy. Who does he think he is, coming at me with this boat? Doesn't he realize we're both going to, crash? And then the boat comes out of the fog, and he realizes there's nobody in the boat. As soon as he sees that, all that anger just disappeared, because it was all of a sudden really silly that he's getting upset at this boat. So what is the boat doing? It's just following the way. It's flowing in the river the only way it could, taken by the currents, and doing exactly what it would do if it was in the water. The Taoists would say that this is what we need to look at doing ourselves, is how do we get in that flow and move in a similar way. But I think we could take this even a step further and say we're actually all empty boats. Now, this might sound a little disturbing at first. Let me break this down a little bit. So if we think about what we were saying in terms of there's patterns to the world, and that these patterns are actually essential for everything, and if they didn't function the same way every time, life itself would not be possible. Existence would not be possible. Our ability to learn anything would not be possible. One of the ways we might talk about this in more of a modern physics sense is to say that if you want to know what's going to happen next, you just simply need to know the complete state of the system at a certain point, apply the laws of physics, and then what's next is what follows from those laws of physics. Now, there's no way to actually know the exact state of everything in the universe, and we don't have perfect knowledge of the state of physics. However, in concept, we see how this works. But what this means is if we are actually a part of that same system, everything is actually determined. Not in the sense that it's predetermined. There's not this idea that there's some deity up there in this Daoist sense that's dictating how everything's going to unfold according to a particular plan, but it's unfolding according to patterns that, much like the starlings, are forming these complex, amazing things of their own just based off how they interact with their neighbor. We are all subject to the forces of these patterns ourselves because we are actually a part of that. So, where that takes us then is that everything, from the Big Bang to this present moment has unfolded in the only way it could. Think about that for a moment. And if we compare that then with the idea that it didn't have to happen this way, now we start to see that maybe this underlying assumption that's causing this frustration with us is maybe an illusion. Maybe it doesn't actually fit with reality. I want to just take a slight detour because this can often bring up questions about free will. Does that mean that I don't have free will? And what I want to say is I think that question is really misguided. The question is not, do we have free will? The question is, do we have the ability to learn? Let me play this out. We actually do choose to do what we want, but we don't get to choose what we want. So, if we were to say something along the lines of, I've got a choice between eating pizza or a hamburger, and I've got to make a choice. Well, I'm going to choose one, and it's going to be the one that I want, which is maybe the pizza. But if you ask me, well, why do I like pizza? That's a really hard question to answer. Why do I like pizza? And there's a ton of things, pretty much everything in terms of our desires. If we roll it back far enough, we can't actually answer that question. There's aspects that have shaped those desires that were not under our control. We can then act on those desires and how we make our choices. And if in some kind of, strange world where we actually could know the nature of everything in the universe and had perfect knowledge of the laws of physics, we could accurately predict what was going to happen. That's not a possibility. But we need to understand that the underlying mechanism in place is how those things function. So where does this go? We might think about this concept that's referred to as the lottery of birth. I did not get to choose my parents. I did not get to choose my parents' parents, and so on. I am a recipient of this long line of history, right, with all these genes and everything that comes with them that comes to be part in a large way of who I am. In the same way that I didn't get to pick my parents, this is going to have a lot of implications in terms of how did my parents raise me? Were they emotionally available? Did they actually take care of me? Or were they, somebody was strung out on crack and didn't have time for me and didn't have a chance to feed me the things that I need for my body and my brain to develop the way that they need to develop? Again, all these things I don't have any control over. They're just happening to me. And what kind of education did I get? Did my parents have the resources to send me to a good school? Or was I stuck in a place that was really suffering because it was not being paid attention to? What kind of religion was I raised in? Did I grow up in a family that was, the Ku Klux Klan? I'm going to be imprinted by that if that were the case in a way that I can't even begin to imagine. But then I still wouldn't have had any choice over that. And then we have our experiences. So if we start to think about who I am as a person, there's a tremendous amount, probably everything that goes into who I am that I had no actual control over. However, I do have the ability to learn. And being able to learn, touch the stove, that didn't feel good. I can now know not to do it next time. That isn't a question about free will. That's a question about, did I have the ability to learn the pattern that if I touch this, it's hot? And isn't that actually what we want? Don't we want our choices and the decisions that we make to be based off of who I am as a person, what my experience has been, what my education has been, the things that I've learned along the way? And if that's the case, and all those things are going into shaping those desires, then I can still be very comfortable with that. The idea that I don't actually have free will, which is very difficult to even define. What would it mean to be able to make a decision that had nothing to do with who you are, what you believe, what you've learned in the past? It would be insanity. And do we want that? No. We want to be people who learn and experience and grow and utilize that in what we do. Slight detour on that. I know this comes up a lot if you follow any of the science stuff lately about determinism and free will, but I think, again, it's not the right question. The question is, do we learn? So each of us, then, is the current result of a chain of cause and effect going all the way back to the Big Bang. We are each a unique, beautiful expression of the laws of nature. We have different perspectives, personalities, and abilities. We exercise our gifts in the way that only we can, given our unique constellations of thoughts, desires, and feelings. But none of us made ourselves. So, acceptance in the new story. Part of what happens then is when we see ourselves in this chain of cause and effect is that in thinking about responsibility, we have to shift our thinking. It's not so much that somebody is kind of like separate from the rest of reality and not impacted by everything else that they grew up and what they're a part of. They are positionally responsible. If we think about that long chain of cause and effect, at some point is where we are, and so we're responsible for what's happening at that point. Not that we actually caused it or had control, but that's who was there when it happened. I am the place where this long chain of forces terminates and happens. And that might mean I'm doing something that's inappropriate. And it doesn't mean that people aren't held accountable for those actions, but it's done differently. It's not done from the perspective of this person could have done otherwise, but they chose not to, in which case we might be tempted to think of justice in terms of retributive justice. How do I get my pound of flesh? How do we make them pay? How do we make them hurt? But when we see that all of us are actually part of a whole slew of forces way beyond anything we had any control over, that justice then turns into something that's a little bit more like restorative justice. And we have to ask bigger questions. What's going on in our culture, in our society, that is producing people that are acting like this? If we just toss it up to this individual chose themselves to do this bad thing, it blinds us to looking at all these other factors. It becomes a scapegoat. This then translates into some interesting things in terms of how do I think about myself. There's plenty of things in my life that I'm not exactly proud of. And I, in the past, would look at these in a very self-defeating way, beating myself up about things that I should have done different. But when I come to see I couldn't have, it shifts that whole perspective, because now I can actually have compassion for who I was and what happened at that point. But I also, because I can learn, have now an ability in a more productive way to actually move forward with making change in my life that's very different than if I start beating myself up, like, you're so stupid, what were you thinking, kind of a question. Learning from those experiences is key. Also, this idea then about emotions. So we think about how we're driven by those emotions. Now those emotions are going to have a very different flavor when I'm interpreting what's happened in my life, because I can start to see the broader picture of how these things all connected. which then ultimately becomes the basis that I have for how can I have compassion for others. All the things that impact me, that have shaped me in the ways that I didn't have any control over, is the same for everybody. And it might not fix whatever the problem was that's happened in terms of a broken relationship or something that's happened in terms of society, but it gives us a different way of looking at it that allows us to maintain that compassion and move forward in ways that are actually going to be more effective, because we're looking at the patterns of how these things work instead of just making assumptions about things that don't actually exist. So if we go back to the software engineer in me, if I solve the problem for somebody's bad character and they don't actually have character, I haven't solved the problem. If the problem is that there's this chain of events that shape all of us in different ways, now we can have a better chance of understanding, okay, here's all this chain of dominoes. I know if this one falls, that one's going to fall. Here's where I need to move this one out of the way in order to affect change. The thing that seems like it captures us in terms of these patterns, this idea of determinism, is actually the thing that empowers us to be able to make that change so that we can actually do something. So the bottom line then is we're looking at this idea of acceptance and compassion really versus the idea of forgiveness. And I know sometimes people struggle with this idea of forgiveness, and I don't want to undermine other traditions that have a heavy focus on that. But from this Daoist perspective, what's needed is not how do we forgive this person for what they did, but how do we have compassion for understanding what brought about the situation that happened? Because that's where we can actually make some change. So this idea then of acceptance about the things that we cannot change does have that capacity to bring that not only serenity, that peace, but it also gives us the ability to have compassion, both for ourselves and for others. So, there we go. A couple of websites if you're curious to know more about this. Kinship Cafe is where I do my regular Daoist teachings. Jim Jones Online will give you a little bit more about me if you want to find out who this crazy person is. And then this last one here, the Sci-Fi LS, and that LS is for lecture series. This is for a new event that's going to actually be happening here at Pauma Valley in May 2nd and 3rd. And I'll actually be engaging in some of the similar material we covered today, but we're also having Lawrence Krauss, who is a theoretical physicist, world-renowned, that's going to be here talking about the other aspects of what do we know about the nature of reality. It's going to make for a wonderful event. It's 2 days, fully catered. Ticket information will go on sale soon, but you can find out about the event at Sci-Fi LS. So, with that, we have a little bit of time if you guys have some questions. This was a very quick overview of a lot of stuff, so I imagine there might be some unanswered things. Yes, Jerry?
Well, I was thinking about, you're talking about acceptance and compassion. And there are some situations or some people, for instance, that I can be compassionate about and understand how they became the way they became.
Yeah.
But those people can still be toxic.
Yes.
And the situation can be toxic, right? So accepting that doesn't mean embracing it, I don't think.
Correct. Yeah, so the idea of acceptance doesn't mean that there's nothing that we do about it. So let's say, somebody is killing people. Obviously, we just don't say, oh, well, it's not his fault. We take them and remove them from society, right? But it's looked at more in the sense of like a public health issue. Somebody is sick with a contagious disease, we might remove them from being in public, but not because we're trying to punish them, but because there's something that needs to be addressed that's not healthy for everybody else. So that would be where that compassion is still in place, but it doesn't necessarily, it's not saying that there isn't anything that we do. And the same thing on a personal level, if we have relationships that are toxic, we can have that compassion, but it doesn't mean that we have to hang out with them. Yeah. Yes.
Could you talk a little bit about the difference or the similarity between forgiveness and acceptance? Because in my mind, I don't see how you could say, I forgive that, or you, without acceptance. They seem kind of the same to me.
So forgiveness is usually rooted in a couple of different concepts. One of them, on more purely of a secular perspective, is going to be the fact that us holding on to a grudge is going to be detrimental to our health. And so there's an aspect of what we might say about forgiveness that we need to practice for ourselves that is almost independent of the other person. And whether or not the other person recognizes that they did wrong and accepts that and repents and whatever else is secondary to the idea that I have to let it go, right? A lot of people wrestle with that one because how do I let it go? At a foundational level, the idea of forgiveness is that there was a wrong that was done and there is some type of justice maybe that I am owed, but I'm willing to forego it, is how that kind of forgiveness would actually function. Acceptance, in the worldview we're talking about, where everything is determined, there's a whole different road, right? Because how does a person repent for something that they didn't have control over? And my needing them to repent doesn't quite work. So acceptance in this context has to do with recognizing more the nature of reality, and then the question of how do we move forward compassionately in terms of where do we go from here. It's maybe some subtle differences, but there's a whole different like psychological concept that's going on in terms of how those things unfold. Does that help?
Yeah, it did. It's the grudge bit that I wasn't thinking about.
Yeah. Well, we've got about 10 minutes left if there's any other questions. Yes?
So I'm still struggling with acceptance when it comes to, in the Taoist worldview, to explain how a major world leader can blow up another country. So we got 3 of those going on right now, and acceptance. So accept the things that cannot change. What do I do with that acceptance of what I cannot change?
Yeah. So what's interesting, you bring up the political implications, is the Tao Te Ching itself is really written to prospective rulers of the time about how to govern, right? How to do rulership. So it actually speaks a fair amount to that. It'd take a little bit more time to get into like what the Taoist political philosophy would be, but in terms of our modern situation, where we've got craziness happening in our world, whether we're thinking about the active wars that are going on or the maybe dissatisfaction with what our options are in terms of political leadership and so forth. I think where I draw strength from this perspective is that idea that small is not insignificant. So even though I'm not in a position to pull certain levers or kick people out of office or force people to sit down at the table together, almost kind of like what Gandhi's saying, in terms of being the change you want to see in the world, that if we understand how everything is connected and how those implications can spread, then that individual change can actually have a profound impact that we don't need to feel as disempowered. But the more that we can grow this way of thinking, it has the potential for change to happen. So we don't have to go back very far in U.S. history to see really a staggering change that happened in terms of public perception, and that's around gay marriage. And wherever somebody falls on this spectrum of thinking about that concept, we went from a very easily publicly denounceable position that was not difficult to hold to almost overnight it switching to all of a sudden it was completely the opposite, and you had to be almost hiding if you held that position still. How did that happen? It didn't happen from somebody at the state level throwing the lever and making the law and saying this is the law of the land. That ultimately happened, but only because there was a tremendous public upswell of change. And that change, ultimately, in some of the different books that I've read that explore this issue, had to do with things like movies that allowed people to perceive a situation from somebody else's perspective. And that when we're able to put ourselves in somebody else's shoes, that's what really opens the, I mean, we could think about all kinds of social change that has happened and continues to need to happen, whether we're talking about racism type issues or any of the other isms. Once people are able to actually know someone in that context or put themselves in their shoes, it makes a world of difference, and ultimately it shifted really dramatically culturally. And so I think there's room for where that small is not insignificant to have an effect. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, if not, we'll bring that to a close, and thank you very much for having me out.
I did have, one interjection. And so there are more people educated today than ever before in the world.
Yeah.
And so, Tao and Taoist, Zen Buddhism, they've been around for a long time in preaching the same concepts. So is the Catholic Church, and so is Judaism, But why do we see such turmoil in the world?
Yeah, well, again, the Daoists have a critique on that.
Well,
Yeah.
I have a theory on it too.
Yeah.
I think it's biological. It has to do with competition. The guy who wants to be numero uno.
So one of the things we can think about there from the Taoist perspective is if we are trying to understand those patterns, then if there is a genetic component to what it means to be masculine that is causing this type of behavior, then we will have better understandings on how we can address that. It is, I think, fundamentally the big shift, and I hope this doesn't sound too disruptive, but with a lot of other traditions, they tend to have doctrines that are making statements about things. And especially if it comes from a religious context, it can become very difficult to ever challenge those ideas, and they can persist. And one of the things that's fascinating about the Tao Te Ching is it doesn't actually end up spelling out what you should or shouldn't do. It's giving you the methodology. It's almost like saying, here's a scientific method, but it's going to continuously get updated as we learn more things and understand more things, and that's one of the ways it stays so timeless. If we have something that's stopping us from looking at human nature in certain ways because they're making doctrinal claims about it, then it makes a roadblock for making any type of progress. So here I think we've got something that is much more open to the possibility at getting to what that ultimate result is, because it's focused on how do we understand those patterns, how do we understand the nature of reality. It's not telling us what the nature of reality is, it's telling us to look to see what the nature of reality is.
Sorry, one more question, Steve. Where does the concept of morality fit in
Taoism?
Yeah.
It doesn't.
That's my take.
Yeah, it is. It would say that ultimately moral language is equivalent to a bully stick, right? Because it's making a statement that if we're trying to address behavior by claiming that somebody's being immoral, we're making some kind of statement that stop doing that. But it can't be justified because morality doesn't have any basis in reality. It's a subjective thing, but we use it as though it's objective. And so what the Taoists would be saying is that we need to recognize the subjective nature of our value judgments and reevaluate them. It's not to say that we don't end up with value statements, like in particular, they're saying we should try to model our life after the Tao, the way or the pattern of things. So it's not that they don't have any shoulds, but it leaves it very open to discussion. And that if we're going to have collective value judgments, then we have to have ways of justifying it, not just claiming it's evil or good, right? So why do we drive on the right side of the road? It doesn't really matter, right? But we can all see the benefit because we want to be able to get home safely, so we can agree on something like that. The moral statements are much harder, you know? I mean, there's a lot of public sphere moral statements you can think of that get very complicated.
Right. Then you add organized religion to that on top of it, and that's a whole other.
Let's see, there's a difference between the two. In my eyes, there's a very big difference between something like Taoism, which is to me a philosophy, and Christianity.
Yeah, there's, and this is where I'm presenting it, the philosophical version of it versus what later becomes a religious version of Taoism. So what I presented could potentially be very different from what you might hear from somebody else. So I'm not the keeper of all things Tao, and this is the absolute gold standard, but this is as a naturalist, how I've interpreted it, and I find it extremely functional and helpful in our current climate.
And Jim said he started to get interested in this in high school. So we have a ways to go.
Yeah, well, I got exposed to it in high school,
Ah.
but honestly, I was not able to make kind of heads or tails of it. I actually went through a process. I've been a software engineer for a long time, but in the middle of that, I actually went back to school and got my Master's of Divinity and became a Christian pastor for a while. So I've kind of gone through that aspect of things, and really some of the key things I learned there was about cultural anthropology and social linguistics and how these things come into play in terms of interpreting ancient texts. And it really gave me some really powerful resources for then how to later in life approach the Tao Te Ching. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.